Mary lived in a small town in the Wild West, a place where the sun was hot, the air dry, and the ground cracked with dust. The town was small but full of whispers, and people often kept to themselves because speaking too much could invite trouble. Trouble often came from the men who called themselves priests. They dressed in long black robes, carried heavy books, and spoke with loud voices that made people shake with fear. These priests had once come to the town saying they were here to bring order, but over time their order turned into control. They made rules for everything: how women should behave, how men should work, and even how children should play. They punished anyone who dared to question them. Mary was a widow. Her husband John had died 2 winters ago in a riding accident. He had been strong, gentle, and loving, but one cold night his horse slipped on a patch of ice and he never came home. Mary was left with a little boy named Samuel, who had only turned 5 the week after his father's passing. Life became harder for Mary, but she was not a woman who gave up easily. She kept her small farm running, rising early every morning to feed the animals, water the crops, and mend what needed mending. She worked with her hands until they were sore, but she never complained. The priests, however, did not like her independence. In their eyes, a widow should be humble and obedient. They said she should give part of her land to the church, since she no longer had a husband to protect it. But Mary refused. That land had been her husband's gift to her, and she wanted to keep it for Samuel's future. "My boy will grow on this land," she told them. "He will know his father's name and his father's work." The priests did not like her answer. They called her proud, stubborn, and sinful. Whispers began to spread around town. Some said the priests wanted her land for themselves. Others said they simply wanted to make an example of her, so that no one else would dare to stand up against them. People talked in hushed tones at the saloon, the blacksmith shop, and the trading post. But when the priest walked by, everyone fell silent. One hot afternoon, the priest gathered the townspeople in the main square. The sun blazed overhead and the dust swirled around their feet. Children clung to their mothers and men stood with their hats in their hands, uneasy but afraid to leave. The priest declared that Mary had broken the sacred rules. They said she had refused to obey and now she had to be punished. 2 of the priests grabbed Mary by the arms and dragged her into the center of the square. She struggled, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Samuel cried out, running after her, but another priest held him back. The boy screamed for his mother, but his small voice was drowned out by the heavy chanting of the priests. The crowd stood still. No one moved to help. People looked at each other nervously, but everyone knew what it meant to oppose the priests. Some had seen neighbors whipped, shamed, or driven out of town. Fear kept them rooted to the ground. Mary was forced down to the dirt. Her dress caught on the rough stones and her hair fell loose around her face. The priests raised their hands and shouted words about sin and obedience. Their voices echoed against the wooden walls of the saloon and the church. Dust clung to Mary's skin and she felt the roughness of the earth pressing into her. But even as she lay there, she did not beg. She did not cry out for mercy. She lifted her chin and looked at the priests with steady eyes. Samuel's sobs grew louder. "Leave my mama alone," he cried. The people in the crowd looked away, some wiping their eyes, but still no one stepped forward. Fear was stronger than sympathy. The priests pressed her harder into the ground, their boots grinding into the dirt. One of them raised his voice and said, "This is what happens to those who think they are above the law of the church. This woman thought she could stand against us. Now let her be an example to all of you." The sun blazed hotter. A hush fell over the crowd. The sound of the wind rattled through the wooden shutters of the buildings. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. People held their breath as though the air itself had grown heavy. Mary's heart pounded, but her spirit did not break. She thought of her husband, of his laughter and his strong hands. She thought of Samuel, his small arms clinging to her neck at night. She thought of the land she had promised to protect, the home that carried her husband's memory. She would not give up even if they pressed her into the dust. The priests tightened their hold and one of them prepared to strike her. But in that moment something shifted. The sound of horse hooves echoed down the street. Slow, steady, powerful. The crowd turned their heads toward the sound. Dust rose in the distance as a lone rider approached. His horse was tall and dark, and his figure cast a long shadow in the sunlight. The air seemed to change as he drew closer, the rhythm of hooves breaking the silence that had trapped the town. Mary lifted her head just enough to see him. Samuel stopped crying for a moment, his wide eyes fixed on the rider. The priests hesitated, their hands still gripping Mary but their attention drawn to the stranger. The townsfolk whispered nervously. Some recognized the cowboy. They had seen him pass through before, a man who never stayed long but who carried himself with quiet strength. He rode into the square, his eyes scanning the scene. The priest froze, unsettled by his calm stare. The cowboy dismounted, his boots landing firmly on the ground. The sound of his spurs clicked in the silence. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, tall and steady, his presence alone enough to shift the balance of the moment. Mary felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She didn't know who this man was or why he had come, but in that instant, she knew she was no longer alone. Samuel's small voice broke the silence again, but this time it was filled with hope. "Mama, someone's here." The priests exchanged nervous glances. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. The cowboy said nothing yet, but his steady gaze spoke louder than words. The crowd leaned forward, waiting. Something was about to change. The dusty main street of the little town seemed frozen as the cowboy's horse came to a stop. People who had been standing still with fear now shifted their eyes between the priests and the newcomer. Nobody spoke, but everyone felt the change. It was as if the dry desert wind had carried in not just dust but also courage. Mary, still held down by the priests, tried to lift her face. The sun glared, making her squint, but she could see him more clearly now. A tall man with broad shoulders, his shirt faded from travel, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes. His horse was strong, muscles rippling with each movement, and the dust around its hooves hung like a cloud in the air. Samuel, her little boy, clutched at his chest, his tears slowing as he looked at the cowboy with something close to wonder. The priest did not release Mary. Instead, one of them straightened and called out in a loud voice, "Stranger, this does not concern you." "Ride on." But the cowboy didn't move. He let the silence stretch before he finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, and deep enough for everyone to hear. "It concerns me when I see injustice. Let her go." The words cut through the heavy heat like a knife. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one had dared to speak against the priests in such a direct way before. The townsfolk glanced nervously at one another. They had wished for someone to stand up, but they had not dared hope it would happen. The priests tightened their grip on Mary, pressing her down harder into the dirt as if to show they were still in control. "This woman defied the law of the church," one of them sneered. "She must be punished for her arrogance." The cowboy took one slow step forward, dust rising around his boots. His hand rested casually near his belt, not on his gun but close enough to remind everyone that he was no ordinary traveler. He spoke again, his tone calm but carrying weight. "The law of men is not above the law of what's right. And what you're doing here is wrong." The crowd stirred. A blacksmith in the back whispered to his neighbor, "Did you hear that? He's not afraid." A woman near the trading post clutched her shawl tighter, hope flickering in her eyes. Even the children sensed that something different was happening. Samuel, still being held back by one of the priests, found his voice. "Please, mister, help my mama." His little cry made the cowboy glance his way. Jack, though most of the town did not yet know his name, gave the boy a slow nod, a promise without words. The priests bristled, their pride wounded. "You dare challenge us, stranger? You are outnumbered. Leave now before we decide to punish you too." Jack's eyes narrowed. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took another slow step closer. The tension was so thick that people could almost feel it pressing against their skin. His boots crunched on the dirt. His voice was steady. "If you lay another hand on her, you'll regret it. Let her go." The priest tried to laugh, but the sound was weak. They motioned toward a few men who usually acted as their helpers during such displays of power. But those men hesitated. They looked at the cowboy, then at the priests, then at the silent crowd. For once, they were not so quick to obey. Mary's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of the priests holding her down, but in her heart, she felt something else rising, hope. For months she had fought alone, carrying the burden of keeping her land, protecting her son, and surviving against the priest's threats. Now in front of her stood a man who wasn't afraid. Jack's shadow stretched long in the hot sun. He looked at Mary briefly, his eyes meeting hers. She saw no fear there, only determination. It gave her strength. She lifted her chin even as she was forced against the ground. The priests, realizing the crowd was watching closely, raised their voices louder, trying to regain control. "This woman belongs to the church's judgment," one bellowed, "and this outsider has no say in our town." But the people were no longer so sure. They had seen the cruelty of the priests many times before, but this was the first time someone had spoken against them openly. They watched Jack, their hearts beating faster, waiting for what he would do next. Jack finally stopped walking when he stood only a few paces away. His boots planted firmly in the dirt, he adjusted his hat, squinting slightly under the glare of the sun. Then, in a voice that carried across the square, he said, "You've had your way for too long. That ends today." A hush fell over the square. Even the wind seemed to pause. One of the priests, anger flashing in his eyes, shoved Mary harder into the dirt as if to prove a point. Mary let out a soft cry of pain, and Samuel screamed in protest. That was the breaking point. Jack's eyes darkened. His hand brushed the edge of his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. His voice sharpened like steel. "I said let her go." The priest faltered for just a moment. They looked into his eyes and saw something that made them uneasy. This was not just a wandering cowboy. This was a man who had seen struggle, who had stood through storms, and who would not back down no matter the odds. The crowd began to stir louder now. A man at the back muttered, "He's right." Another whispered, "We've been silent too long." A woman nodded, clutching her child, whispering, "This has to stop." The ripple of voices grew, small but steady, a quiet wave rising against the priest's power. Mary could feel the change even as she lay in the dust. She lifted her eyes again, her face smeared with dirt, but her spirit unbroken. She saw her neighbors finally looking not just at her but at the injustice itself. Samuel broke free of the priest holding him and ran to his mother, throwing his little arms around her shoulders. The priest tried to grab him back, but the crowd shifted forward slightly, murmuring louder as if warning them not to harm the boy. Jack took one more step forward. His presence filled the square. He wasn't just standing up for Mary, he was standing up for the whole town. His calm defiance gave everyone something they had been missing for too long: courage. The priests shouted again, trying to cover their growing fear, but their voices did not carry the same weight as before. The cowboys' steady words lingered in the air, and the townsfolk couldn't unhear them. The standoff had begun, and though no gun was fired and no fist was thrown, everyone knew something had changed forever in that dusty little square. The square was silent except for the sound of Samuel's sobs and the restless shifting of boots on the dirt. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, like the weight pressing down on everyone's chest. The priests stood tall, but for the first time their authority did not feel solid. The cowboy's presence had shaken them. His steady gaze, the way he moved without fear, the way his words cut deeper than their shouts, all of it had unsettled the men who were used to ruling through intimidation. Jack the cowboy did not rush. He stood still, letting the silence work in his favor. His boots were planted firmly on the ground, his broad shoulders squared, his eyes sharp under the shadow of his hat. He had no need for loud threats. His calmness itself was a weapon. "Let her go," he said again, his voice low but clear, carrying over the crowd. The priests shifted uncomfortably. One of them sneered, but his sneer did not carry the same confidence it once would have. "This is not your business," he said, though his voice cracked slightly. "You ride into our town, you think you can tell us what to do. You'll regret this, stranger." Jack's hand hovered near his holster, but he still didn't draw. His voice remained calm. "I don't need to tell you what to do. You already know what's right. You're just afraid of losing your power." The townsfolk murmured again, louder this time. Those words struck home. Everyone in the square knew deep down that the priest's power was built on fear, not on fairness. They had all seen neighbors punished for small things. They had all lowered their heads when the priests walked past, too afraid to look them in the eye. But now they were watching someone do what they hadn't dared, stand tall against them. Mary, still down on the ground, felt her heart pounding. The rough dirt stung her hands and knees, but she didn't care. She lifted her face, her eyes locking with Jack's. For the first time in months, she felt strength, not just from within herself, but from someone standing with her. Samuel clung to her, his little arms tight around her shoulders. He looked at Jack with wide, trusting eyes. To him, the cowboy seemed like a hero who had stepped out of nowhere to protect them. The priests, realizing they were losing control, barked orders at the men who usually followed them. "Seize him!" one shouted. But the men hesitated. Their eyes flicked from the priests to Jack, then to the restless crowd. No one moved forward. Fear had ruled them before, but now that same fear was cracking. Jack saw the hesitation. He took another slow step forward. His spurs clicked against the dirt, the sound sharp in the tense silence. He looked directly at the priests, his eyes like steel. "You've already lost them," he said softly. The priests stiffened. Their hands twitched nervously at their sides. They tried to raise their voices louder, but it only made them look desperate. "Do not listen to him," one cried out. "We are your leaders. Obey us, or you will face punishment too." But the crowd didn't shrink back this time. Instead, a man at the back, a blacksmith with arms thick from hammering iron, stepped forward slightly. "He's right," the blacksmith muttered loud enough for others to hear. "This ain't justice. This is cruelty." A ripple went through the townsfolk. A shopkeeper nodded in agreement. A woman near the front clutched her child and whispered, "We can't let this continue." Jack's presence had unlocked something inside them. Fear was no longer enough to keep them silent. The priests grew angrier. They pressed Mary down harder, as if punishing her in front of everyone would restore their control. Mary winced, but she refused to cry out. Her silence itself was a quiet act of defiance. Jack saw it. His jaw tightened. He took another step forward, now standing only a few feet from them. His voice grew firmer, sharper. "I said let her go." One of the priests glared at him, trying to act bold. "And if we don't?" he demanded. Jack didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed. "Then you'll answer to me." The crowd gasped softly. The priests looked at him, and for a moment they saw something in his eyes that sent a chill down their spines. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't just some traveler passing through. He was a man who meant every word. Mary felt the tension thicken. She held Samuel close, whispering softly, "It's going to be all right." She didn't know how she could promise that, but she believed it now. Jack's calm confidence made her believe it. The priests, sensing their grip slipping, tried once more to assert themselves. "This town belongs to us," one shouted. "Without us there is no order." Jack shook his head slowly. "This town belongs to its people, and they don't need your fear to live." The words hit the crowd like a spark to dry grass. Murmurs turned into voices. People nodded, some muttering agreement under their breath, others louder now. "He's right," someone shouted. The priests paled. Their eyes darted around, realizing the tide was turning against them. They tightened their hold on Mary again, almost in panic. But Jack took one more step forward, his boots inches from theirs. His hand now rested fully on his holster, though he still hadn't drawn his weapon. "You've got two choices," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Let her go, or answer for what you're doing." The priests froze. They had never been challenged this way before. The crowd's voices grew louder behind Jack, rising like a wave. The priests looked at each other nervously. Mary, still pressed to the ground, felt the shift. For the first time she saw fear not in the townsfolk, but in the priests. Samuel tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Mama, he's winning." And Mary, her eyes wet but her spirit strong, whispered back, "Yes, he is." The square seemed to hold its breath. The standoff was no longer just between Jack and the priests. It was between fear and courage, silence and truth. The priests stood frozen, their power slipping like sand through their fingers. The cowboy had not drawn his gun, had not raised his voice, yet he had already changed everything, and everyone knew this was only the beginning. The square felt like it was holding its breath. Every man, woman, and child stood frozen, eyes locked on the scene in the center. The priests kept their grip on Mary, but their hands were trembling now. Their faces were red with anger, but their eyes betrayed something else, fear. It was not just fear of the cowboy standing in front of them. It was fear of losing the power they had held over the town for so long. Jack didn't move quickly. He didn't have to. His calmness carried more strength than any raised voice. He planted his boots firmly in the dust and let his eyes sweep across the crowd before resting again on the priests. His voice came steady and low, but each word carried weight. Justice isn't fear. Justice is fairness. You've been using fear to control these people, but fear doesn't last forever. Today it ends. The words hit like a hammer striking an anvil. The blacksmith near the back nodded firmly, his jaw set. The shopkeeper's hands shook, but he raised his chin in agreement. A woman with a child clutched her little one closer and whispered, "He's right. He's right." The murmurs grew louder. For the first time in years, people were no longer whispering only in corners. They were speaking in the open, right in front of the priests. The priests looked around nervously, realizing the tide was turning. One of them shouted louder, trying to regain control. "Silence! Do not be swayed by this outsider. He knows nothing of this town." But the crowd didn't fall silent this time. Instead, the blacksmith took a step forward, his voice deep and clear. "We've known enough. We've watched you take from us, shame us, and hurt good people, and we've stayed quiet because we were afraid. But not anymore." A ripple of agreement spread through the square. Men nodded. Women whispered encouragement. Even the children sensed something powerful was happening. Mary, still on the ground, felt the change as strongly as the heat of the sun on her back. She could hardly believe it. For so long she had fought silently, bearing the weight of her defiance alone. Now, because of one man's courage, her neighbors were finding their own voices. Samuel clung to her, his eyes wide with awe. He whispered, "Mama, they're helping us." She kissed the top of his dusty hair and whispered back, "Yes, my boy, they finally are." The priest, furious, tried one last time to command obedience. "If you do not obey, you will all suffer," one shouted. But his voice cracked and the threat fell flat. The people were no longer afraid in the same way. Jack didn't let the moment slip. He took one slow step closer until he stood right in front of the priests. His shadow fell across them. His hand rested calmly on his belt close to his holster, but still he didn't draw. His voice was firm. "Let her go. Now." The priests hesitated, but their hesitation told everyone the truth. They were no longer in control. Slowly, grudgingly, they loosened their hold on Mary. She fell forward onto her hands, gasping as the pressure lifted. Samuel rushed to her, wrapping his little arms around her shoulders. Tears filled her eyes, not from weakness, but from the relief of knowing she was finally free. Jack bent slightly and extended a hand to her. For a moment, Mary hesitated, unused to relying on anyone. But then she looked into his eyes, steady, kind, and unshaken, and she took his hand. He pulled her gently to her feet. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some clapped. Others cheered quietly, unsure if it was safe yet, but unable to contain their relief. The sound was small at first, but it grew stronger as more voices joined in. The priests stood frozen, their faces pale with fury. They had been exposed in front of everyone. Their greatest weapon, fear, was slipping away. They tried to shout over the noise, but their words were drowned out by the growing voices of the townsfolk. Jack turned his back on them deliberately, a gesture that said more than words. He guided Mary and Samuel toward the crowd, his tall frame shielding them. His voice carried as he spoke not just to her, but to everyone present. "You don't have to live in fear anymore. These men only have power if you give it to them. Stand together and they can't control you." The townsfolk absorbed his words like thirsty ground soaking up rain. For years they had needed someone to remind them of their own strength. Now, here it was, spoken plainly and shown in action. The blacksmith stepped forward fully now, standing tall beside Jack. "He's right," he said firmly. "We've been letting them take everything from us. It ends today." A ranch hand joined him, then a shopkeeper. Then two more men and a woman who had always kept her head down. One by one, people stepped closer to Jack, creating a line of support. The priests' faces turned red with rage. They shouted insults, cursed the crowd, and raised their fists. But the louder they shouted, the clearer it became that their voices no longer carried power. Mary stood upright, brushing dust from her dress, her chin high despite the redness on her skin from being pressed into the dirt. She held Samuel's hand tightly. Her voice trembled, but it rang with truth. "You thought you could break me. But you've only shown everyone what you really are." The crowd erupted again, this time with louder cheers. The sound filled the square, drowning out the priests completely. Jack stood tall, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He didn't smile, but inside he felt satisfaction. not for himself, but for the widow beside him and the people around him. He had come into town as a stranger, but he had given them back something they had lost: courage. The priests, realizing they had lost, slowly backed away. Their robes flapped in the wind as they retreated toward the church. Their eyes burned with anger, but their power was broken in that moment. They knew it, and so did everyone else. The crowd didn't chase them. They didn't need to. They had already won. As the noise settled, neighbors rushed to Mary's side. A woman handed her a cloth to wipe her face. A man gave Samuel a piece of candy from his pocket to calm him down. The people who had once looked away in silence were now reaching out in kindness. Mary looked around, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew the words were too small for what she felt. She looked at Jack, her voice steadier. "You saved us," Jack shook his head slightly. "I only reminded them what they already knew." Mary smiled faintly, holding Samuel close. The crowd lingered, their voices buzzing with new energy, but their eyes kept returning to the cowboy. He had done what none of them had dared, and they knew they would never forget it. For the first time in years, the little town felt lighter, as though the dust itself had lifted. But though victory filled the air, everyone also knew this was not the end. The priests had retreated, but they were not gone. They would try to strike back, and the cowboy? He was ready for whatever came next. The square was still buzzing with voices, but the priests were gone, retreating into the heavy wooden doors of the church. The people watched them disappear, their robes fluttering angrily in the dry wind. For the first time in years, the townsfolk realized that those men did not look powerful anymore. They looked small, desperate, and beaten. Jack stood tall in the center of the square, his broad hat tilted slightly, his boots covered with dust. He wasn't smiling, but his calm face carried quiet satisfaction. He had not drawn his gun, had not raised his fists, but he had broken the chains of fear that had weighed down the town for too long. Mary stood beside him, Samuel's little hand wrapped tightly in hers. Her dress was torn at the knees, her face still smudged with dirt, but she looked stronger than she had in a long time. Neighbors who once turned away now came forward, offering comfort. A woman draped a shawl over her shoulders. Another handed her water from a tin cup. Mary nodded, whispering thanks. The blacksmith clapped a heavy hand on Jack's shoulder. "You've given us back our courage, stranger," he said. His voice was thick with emotion. "We won't forget this." Jack shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me. I only reminded you of what was already inside you." The words carried through the crowd, and many nodded. Deep down, they all knew he was right. They had let fear control them for too long, but now they had seen the truth. Strength came when they stood together. Mary knelt beside Samuel, brushing the dirt from his cheeks. Her voice was soft. "It's over, my boy." But Jack's eyes flicked toward the church. He didn't say anything, but he knew it wasn't over yet, not completely. Men who clung to power didn't surrender easily. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the town in shades of gold and orange, the crowd slowly dispersed. People spoke in low voices, already planning to meet again, already talking of how they would change things. The priests might try to strike back, but the townsfolk had tasted freedom, and they would not go back to silence. Mary led Samuel toward her small farm on the edge of town. She walked with her chin higher than she had in months. Jack walked beside them, his long stride steady, his eyes watchful. Samuel skipped a little, still clinging to his mother's hand, but now his face was lit with hope. At the farmhouse, the air smelled of hay and earth. Chickens clucked softly near the coop, and the fading light stretched long shadows across the field. Mary stopped at the fence, turning to face Jack. "You didn't have to come," she said softly, "but you did. You saved us." Jack shook his head again, his voice calm. "You were already strong. I only stood with you." Mary looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glistening. Most men wouldn't have risked it. "You did," Samuel tugged on Jack's sleeve. "Are you staying, mister?" he asked eagerly. "We could use a cowboy here." Jack chuckled softly, crouching so he was eye level with the boy. "Maybe for a little while," he said. "But cowboys don't stay in one place too long." Samuel frowned, but then he smiled. "If you leave, will you come back?" Jack tipped his hat. "If you ever need me, son, I'll come." That night, the farmhouse was filled with warmth. Neighbors came with food, bread, beans, roasted chicken, things Mary had struggled to afford on her own. For the first time since John's passing, her home was alive with voices, laughter, and kindness. Samuel sat at the table with wide eyes, eating until he was full, his little body finally relaxing after weeks of worry. Mary sat quietly for a while, simply watching the people around her. She realized that her burden was no longer hers alone. The town had changed. The people who once turned away had now stood up. And all of it had begun with a cowboy who had walked into the square when no one else dared. As the night grew darker, lanterns flickered in windows across the town. But in the church the priests plotted. They whispered angrily, vowing to take back their control. They planned to punish not only Mary but also anyone who had dared to speak against them. They swore they would drive the cowboy out of town. But what they did not realize was that their time had already passed. The people had seen their weakness, and the more they tried to shout and threaten, the less power they held. The next morning, Jack saddled his horse early. The sun was just rising, painting the sky pink and gold. The air was cooler, the smell of dew mixing with the dust. He tightened the straps and checked the reins with the ease of a man who had lived on the trail for years. Mary came out of the farmhouse, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Samuel ran barefoot through the grass, his hair sticking up in the morning breeze. "You're leaving?" Mary asked softly. Jack nodded. "It's time. You don't need me anymore." She looked down for a moment, then back at him. "We may not need you, but we'll never forget you." Jack adjusted his hat. "Don't forget yourselves either. That's where the real strength is." Mary stepped closer. For a moment she seemed like she wanted to say more, but instead she simply reached out and touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel hugged his leg tightly. "Goodbye, Mr. Cowboy. Don't forget me." Jack smiled faintly and patted the boy's head. "I won't forget you, son." He mounted his horse, the saddle creaking softly. The animal snorted, eager to move. Jack looked down at Mary and Samuel one last time. Then he tipped his hat and turned toward the open horizon. The townsfolk gathered silently along the street as he rode out. Some waved. Some simply watched, their eyes filled with gratitude. They all knew they owed him something they could never repay. As he disappeared into the distance, the people slowly returned to their lives. The town was not perfect now, and there would be struggles ahead. The priests would not vanish overnight, but the people were no longer afraid. They had found their voices. They had found their courage. Mary stood by the fence long after he was gone, Samuel leaning against her side. She whispered softly, "He saved us, but now it's up to us." Her boy looked up at her, his eyes bright. "We'll be strong, Mama, just like him." She smiled, pulling him close. "No, my son. Strong like us." The story of that day lived on for years. People told it around campfires and saloons and at family tables. They spoke of the widow who stood her ground, the boy who cried for his mother, and the cowboy who came when no one else dared. It was remembered not just as the day one man saved a woman, but as the day a whole town remembered its own strength. And somewhere out on the trail, the cowboy rode on, his shadow long against the setting sun, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing he had made a difference, then moving forward as cowboys always did.